Joining us this morning is our friend and contributor. His name is Dr. David Beer. He is from Malone University, where he serves as an associate professor of political science. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Beer.
Thanks for having me on again this morning.
And you sound great today, by the way.
Thank you.
Okay, so there's an election coming, not sure if you heard, and one of the things that people are going to be really wound up about is the Electoral College. It happens every presidential election. Can you take us back to the founding? Help us understand why there's an Electoral College.
Yeah, we're trying to kind of find a solution between, do we want to have, kind of a straight democratic system where we have the person with the most votes win, or do we want to, acknowledge the regional differences and the differences in our state populations and things like that. And so the compromise was the Electoral College to sort of balance these things, where in individual states, people vote, and we can count total numbers and we can talk about the overall popular vote. But each state carries a different weight within the Electoral College based on, how many members of the House of Representatives that they have, plus how many senators they have. That yields their Electoral College votes. So, for instance, Ohio has 17 Electoral College votes because we have 2 senators and we have 15 House seats in the Senate. So this for most of our history, this hasn't been much of a problem. But in some recent elections, we've had these situations where you can have a great disparity in the popular vote because of very populous states, but you could have a very close election in the Electoral College. And in fact, you could even have a situation where the person who loses the overall popular vote might win the Electoral College vote, which we saw in 2016 as an example.
So do you think the founders, to any extent, do we have any evidence in Federalist Papers or something that they anticipated that could happen, where someone could win the popular vote but lose the election?
That wouldn't necessarily been too much of a problem for them in their minds, actually, because they actually kind of didn't think the Electoral College would maybe even decide all of the elections. They had the provision put in place for the House of Representatives to make the decision through for president should no one receive a majority in the Electoral College, and that was probably what they thought would happen a lot of times. You imagine, if we're back in the early 1800s, how likely, if you're living in Massachusetts, are you going to know, sort of people who live in Virginia? And so how do you know who'd be the best politician from Virginia to maybe be president of the United States? And so they largely thought that most states would support maybe a local candidate, maybe a local governor or their own individual governor or something like that. And so they weren't thinking that the Electoral College would actually often find the majority winner, unless it's something like a George Washington where everyone knew. Largely, we were pretty sure George Washington was going to be the first president, and we weren't sure how it was going to work out after that point. That's why we're always trying to figure out how exactly our system works, even after all these years.
Yeah, and if my memory serves me correctly, George Washington hated the idea of partisanship, right? And he would be upset that we have parties, right?
Sure. For the fear for the founders was that, parties are factions, right? And we certainly have seen some of that idea in recent years, where we look at the other party that we don't tend to support, and we think that they're sort of the enemy, and that there's a great difference. And that really for Christians, that's because we've maybe given into the idolatry of politics, when really we should have our ultimate allegiance to Christ, and we shouldn't be putting party or country above that kind of thing. So that we should be willing to see, truth wherever it is, and follow God's law in that direction, no matter who our allies are in that moment. So yeah, we're very concerned that our hyper polarization is sort of taking us towards those factions that the founders were really concerned about.
And now, of course, America today is dramatically different than the first few presidential elections, both in geography and population and partisanship and such. So what would be the arguments for and against keeping the Electoral College in place?
Yeah, so the Electoral College hasn't actually let us down that much. It's not necessarily been a problem. There have been those moments where, people have howled about the outcomes, but at the end of the day, it's not necessarily something that's flashing red in our system. And there would be unintended consequences, I would certainly say. We say something like, take an example here of African Americans maybe representing 12% of the American population. Well, in a straight majoritarian system where the popular vote is the sole winners, there's a good argument to say that there would be less significance towards who African Americans are supporting because they are a small percentage of the overall total. However, be in an electoral college system where you can have concentrations of African American communities in particular states, they actually have significant say and significant influence and representation because of that. Same thing you could say for, say, Jewish Americans in, say, the state of Florida, something like that. So actually there's these unintended consequences if you move to a straight majority system where the popular vote is all that matters. There will be people that we won't necessarily have to pay attention to. Just the same way that today we don't necessarily pay attention to, say smaller states like Montana or Wyoming or something like that with a very limited number of electoral votes. The same thing would happen with a popular vote, but it would actually just expand that to a lot more people and a lot more communities in the United States.
Yeah, I've heard that actually, if it went by strictly popular vote, candidates would really only campaign in like California, Texas, and New York or something, right?
Yeah, I mean, it would be something like that where you could simply, use you could use national media, and so you could kind of set up shop in a place where you could have all your appearances, all your commercials produced and things like that. You could broadcast them on major media platforms, but you wouldn't need to worry about introducing yourself to, say, local newspapers, local gatherings of citizens, things like that. And so, yeah, there would be those consequences for how our elections actually run if we did without the Electoral College.
We're looking at some broader issue election things to discuss. One of them I wanted to chat with you about is, each presidential election, there's states that are considered up for grabs. What are the states we ought to be watching this year as the election unfolds?
This is going to be an incredibly tight election. I mean, that can be no doubt in anybody's mind. And so really, it's coming down to about 7 states that are really going to tip the balance for the Electoral College for this election. And so the way to think about it is sort of the maybe the kind of industrial Rust Belt states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And then you've got a couple in the South. You've got Georgia and you've got North Carolina. And then you've got the western states of Arizona and Nevada, and basically they're all within a point or two and could go either way for either candidate. And so those would be the states that really decide these things, and to be able to reach a majority in the Electoral College, which is 270 votes.
As a political scientist, what's your take on polling? I've seen over the past few elections, people get more and more frustrated by pollsters.
Yeah, it's complicated, and we have new technologies now, and that actually make it easier for people to ignore pollsters. And so we have this, it's no longer that everybody's home at a certain time, and you can call on a landline telephone, and also we just have a changing culture where people are less willing to talk to strangers. They're more willing to isolate themselves, and less willing to necessarily engage and say what they really think. I think polling is important, though, if we are going to be in a democratic style where government, where we have people, kind of being able to participate in elections. We sort of need to know ahead of time for consistency, the kind of ideas they're interested in, the ways they may be leaning on an issue. So it is important to engage with polls. However, it is often the case that we can have anomalies where, based on who was willing to answer questions or how the questions were worded or what was going on at the time, how the results come. And we've seen the sort of the misses be in both directions. Certainly, I would say, for instance, in 2016, the polls indicated that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and everyone assumed that, and then that turned out to not be the case because there was an undercounting of support for Donald Trump. But in 2020, the polls also said that there'd be this red wave, and the midterm elections were going to be a massive win for Republicans in the House and the Senate, and that didn't come to play. So we're not entirely sure exactly which way the polls will err. The polls will always err a little bit, and in such a close election, it will really matter in which direction they're erring. Are they erring more like in 2016, where it was undercounting Republican support, or they err like in 2022, where they undercounted Democratic support?
So if I'm remembering my education well enough, you're saying the margin of error in these polls is usually like three to 4 points, and the election is so close that we're just operating within that margin of error.
Oh, we're definitely within our margin of error on these, even if the polls are off in 1 percentage point in either direction, this will have significant consequences in terms of which way the Electoral College goes. And I guess that's another thing to emphasize about the Electoral College. The Electoral College magnifies wins. So if you win the state of Ohio, by 1 vote, you get all 17 Electoral College votes. And for the state of Ohio. And that's actually another important feature, is it's supposed to be contributing to our consolidation, our coming together as Americans when we see these large-scale victories. Instead of spending our time focusing on the, missed by just a little bit, we see these sort of these moments where you have, 300 or more Electoral College, votes. And so you have this, massive win, as opposed to it being, in fact, a very narrow percentage victory when it came down to the actual votes. So it will be a close election, and a couple points will make a huge difference one way or the other.
Now, some states, if I'm not mistaken, actually divide up their electoral votes based on popular vote, don't they?
It's really only Maine and Nebraska at this point. And there is some conversation about other states moving in that direction. And there will be, it'll matter because it's such a close election that we're looking at the Nebraska district near Omaha, and the fact that while the large state as a whole may go for Donald Trump, it's very possible that one electoral vote from that state will go to Kamala Harris. And so it's actually matters because you can, in fact, it is statistically possible and mathematically possible. You could have a 269 tie in the Electoral College, but with that one vote, that might be the kind of thing that could put it over the edge for there to avoid a tie.
What happens if there is a tie?
If there is a tie, it goes to the House of Representatives, where they vote by state delegation for who should be president of the United States. And we haven't seen that for a very long time. And so there would be all kinds of contentious things about how that would operate. But the advantage there would go towards the Republican Party because they are currently the majority in the House. But it's a very slim majority, and they vote by state and not by individual member of the House.
So each state would have to, within themselves in the House, figure out what their vote is?
Yes, and so you could have a situation. You could have a situation where if there are 10 members in a delegation from a state, and 5 want to vote one way and 5 want to vote the other way, we don't actually know what mechanism would be used to figure out in which way that state should vote. Because, like I said, these things haven't been happening really, I think, since 1824. So this is not a often used or well understood part of our governmental system.
Now, that wouldn't be good for America if that happened, but it would be great for political scientists. You guys would love that, wouldn't you? Be like, whoa, cool.
Yeah, you're not wrong there, but you're certainly right in your first statement too, that we like watching chaos in other places. We don't necessarily like living through it ourselves. So for the sake of my country, I do hope we have a easy and clear election.
Now, one last question before we say goodbye, and it has to do with an Ohio State issue. Issue 1 is going to be on the ballot for Ohioans, and I've seen starting to bubble up discussion about that, but also seeing confusion. What is it, basically?
This is really dealing with the fact of redistricting, right? Which because of the census, right, and part of going these compromises, actually going back to our first discussion about the Electoral College. The framers anticipated that as population grew, you would have a census every 10 years, and you could reapportion how many representatives are in the House of Representatives for any particular state. And so every 10 years we do this, and so your Electoral College votes can go up or they can go down. Ohio has been on the losing end of this in the most recent years, but through most of our history, our population kept going up, and so we kept getting more and more members of the House of Representatives. And it becomes really contentious because you can draw the lines for districts to support one party or to support another, and that's what we refer to as gerrymandering. So issue one is trying to set up a nonpartisan, non-political commission that would take care of these things, but it's a very complicated and maybe unwieldy system, and part of it is just going to deal with actually creating lists of qualified people and then randomly selecting names. So it's a strange system that's trying to kind of deal with the political problem, and that people have interests, and they are tempted to support people who align with their interests. Ohio keeps going through these constitutional amendments to try to talk about redistricting, and I would argue partly we keep trying to do it because we're trying to solve a very human problem of self-interest, and we're thinking that we can actually find a perfect solution to that. And I think the Bible would tell us that the heart is deceitful above all things, and so we're not going to be able to find an alternate solution to be able to take care of this problem. But there are some people who think this might be a way forward to have instead of politicians doing these redistrictings, to have non-politicians trying to do it in a more bipartisan fashion.
Again, our guest has been Dr. David Beer. He's director of the Center for Christian Faith and Culture and associate professor of political science at Malone University. If folks want more information about Malone, how can they get it?
You can certainly find us on our website at malone.edu, and we certainly look forward to people visiting for events and special lectures and things like that we hold for the Center for Christian Faith and Culture, and you can find us on Facebook for those details.
Again, Facebook for the Center for Christian Faith and Culture, and then, of course, malone.edu. Dr. David Beer, thanks so much for your time today.